For those of you that don't know me, I wear a lot of hats. You know why? Because I'm follically challenged. I get sunburn. That's why I wear a lot of hats. And there's my new one. Pretty good, huh? What do you think? Nice brim to keep the sun out. Pull it down a little bit. Get that nice gangster look. Or off to the side. Yeah, baby, I get that suave look. Huh? Debonair? Right, ladies? Well, if you want to know how to make one, stick around. Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Phil, and welcome back to my shop. Today I'm going to show you how to make this bowl. This is called a dizzy bowl, otherwise known as a tornado bowl, or a twister bowl. Many different names. The technology comes from a bowl from a board, and I'll go over that more in detail as the video progresses. This is made from many hundreds pieces of exotic woods. It's very complex, it's very lengthy, so without further ado, let's get going. Now for this project, I'm using various woods. I'm using purple hard, yellow hard, African padauk, using some hard maple, and I'm also using another wood species. It's called angelum. It's Brazilian teak, very beautiful yellow golden wood. I purchased these veneers pre-cut from my wood supplier. They're all 1/8 of an inch thick. I set up my cross-cut sled to cut these veneers at a uniform length. My wood supplier was out of maple veneers, so I had to make my own. And look how this hard maple gives my chop saw a workout. You never know, I just sharpened that blade. Over at the joiner, I square up the edges. I just cut that board to 2-inch wide sections, and I'll be attaching these to my resaw sled on my bandsaw. I'm applying blue painter's tape to one side as I'm making my homemade double stick tape using CA glue. Now over at my resaw fence, I apply another piece of that blue tape. I coat one side with CA accelerator spray, and then I apply a thin line of CA glue to the other side. This is my homemade resaw fence. A lot of the parts I use I found around my shop. This screw here has teeth that are 1/16 of an inch. So if I want my piece to be 3/16 of an inch thick, I just turn that screw 3 full turns. Now I pass these through my drum sander to get them to a perfect 1/8 thickness that I'm looking for. Now here's that angelin that I was talking about earlier, that Brazilian teak, beautiful golden yellow. I'm cutting up some purple heart here as well, and I'll be using these long strips to make segmented rings. The rings are going to be the brims of the bowls. I'm making several bowls in this project. However, I'll just be concentrating on one bowl for this video. Now over to my table saw. I've got my segmenting sled set up, and I'll be using this to cut out my angled pieces to make my rings. You've probably seen this sled used in some of my other videos. It makes perfect rings. And this is how I glue up my rings. The wood glue that I'm using is Titebond Original. Now I could allow this ring to dry on its own and it would be fine, but I like to use the hose clamps because it really presses that glue into the pores of the wood. I found I get better results with this. And over to my drum sander to get it perfectly planed. Now over to my 14-inch bandsaw to cut these veneers to the proper width. Now here at the bench, I work on a symmetrical pattern. The bowls are all going to be about 14 inches wide. So I'll make all these about 14.5 inches wide just to give me a little bit of wiggle room. I came up with 3 patterns. I should be able to get 2 bowls from each block. Now it's time to glue them up. I'm placing some salt in this lid. I'll be using the salt to sprinkle on the glue to keep the pieces from slipping and sliding. I'm only gluing half blocks at a time because the first glue up strips are already starting to dry. I'll stand these up out of the way and I'll let them dry overnight. Once dry, I glue these halves together. Now a couple of passes through my planer. Sometimes I come across a board that's just too rough to go through the planer. You gotta have something that sits nice and flat. So here I just take 2 wooden coffee stirrers, cut them in half and glue them on each corner. And then when I flip the piece over, I simply plane the spacers right off. Now over at my drill press, I drill a 1/2-inch hole down the middle of each blank. And you'll see why I do this later in the video. Back over to my resaw sled. I'll be slicing sheets at 1/8 of an inch using a 10 TPI blade. And this blade, believe it or not, is only 3/16 of an inch thick. These veneers come out so smooth, they don't even need to be sanded. And there's no way I could do this without this jig. These ceramic guide blocks are fantastic. They keep the blade perfectly stable and they don't heat up like metal. These are much better than the roller bearing guides as well. In fact, this particular guide used to have roller bearings and I replaced them with this ceramic. The roller bearings add too much vibration. And as you can see, perfectly smooth, no ridges. So here I'm just using my compass to draw out the radius, and I'll bring this over to the bandsaw and trim these pieces off. Each bowl will have 3 or 4 sheets of veneer, depending on my design. And the tape is just to hold these pieces together while I cut it out on the bandsaw. And I save all these cutoffs. I'll make colorful bottle stoppers out of these later down the road. It's time to glue the disc together. I use Titebond Original for these. It glues nice and fast, and it gives me a transparent glue line. Titebond 2 or Titebond 3 will result in a light brown glue line, which obviously I don't want. Before that glue has a chance to set up, I take this time and set up my pattern. In order to get that tornado look, in this case I start with that wide strip of Purple Heart and I space it over 4 strips. And now that I have the pattern set, I now clamp it into my jig. This jig will ensure that I get even clamping pressure throughout the piece. These rings are about 15 inches wide, and there's an awful lot of glue surface. To make sure the outer perimeter is clamped down level to the center screw, I add 8 additional clamps to the outer rim. This will prevent any uneven distortion. And incidentally, even though we're only at the 18-minute mark of this video, everything seems to be moving along pretty quick. However, I'm actually into my 2nd week on this project. With all these glue-ups and clamping and letting them dry overnight, more glue-ups, more clamping, and all that resawing, it's very time-consuming. And speaking of the resawing, those clips that you saw just moments ago were actually sped up to 20 times speed. So I actually spent several days on the bandsaw making all those slices. Seeing me unloosening this screw makes me think maybe I've got a screw loose from spending so much time on these projects. What do you think? Leave me a comment below. I'd be interested to hear your opinion. I read all my comments. And here the final disc. I actually had enough to make 7 bowls all together, different patterns. Now it's very important that both sides of this disc are completely parallel. So I'm going to run these through my drum sander a couple of times. Before I do that, I rub chalk on both surfaces. When I see no chalk residue on the other end, then I know I've hit all the surfaces. A lot of work went into getting these surfaces perfect, and I want to keep them that way. This exotic wood is very dry, and it tends to wick up moisture in my shop if it's laying around. And when this happens, the disc can actually warp. So while I work on one bowl, I'll keep the blanks for the other ones clamped up in my homemade press. I mentioned early in the video that I was going to be using a bowl from a board technique. Let me explain to you how this works. Basically, you start with one flat board, You draw circles in there, you split that in half, bring it over to the bandsaw, and you cut out your angles. In theory, those angles, if you cut it correctly, they'll fit on top of each other just enough to hold a glue joint. Then you attach that to the lathe and turn it to shape. Now here's a walnut bowl I did a few years ago. Rather than getting into too much detail about the math that goes into this, I will assure you that it is complex. So as you can see here, I've been taking measurements all around the disc, getting averages. I take about 8 samples around the disc, and then I take the average of those 8, and then I come up with the average thickness. The average thickness and the circumference of the disc will give me the angle I need to cut these out perfect. But I won't be cutting these out on the bandsaw like I've done in the past, because I've got a new secret weapon in the shop. And that secret weapon is my new Ringmaster jig. This apparatus attaches to my lathe, and it allows me to execute the bowl from a board technique with absolute perfect precision. It also allows me to speed up the process dramatically. The unit has 2 high-speed cutters that cuts from both sides of the piece while it's on the lathe. This is an impossible technique on the bandsaw. And as you can see here, this is why I had to drill that 1/2-inch hole in the middle. This is how I mount the piece. Once I cut through half of one side, I put this painter's tape on here to keep the ring from flying off when the other side is cut. yourself a favor, like and subscribe. Leave a comment below, tell me what's on your mind. Then do yourself a favor, like and subscribe. I'll save the best for last, I ain't gonna lie. Do yourself a favor, like and subscribe. Now let's get back to the show before you think I'm unkind. Do yourself a favor, like and subscribe. Subscribe. Like and subscribe. Subscribe. Like and subscribe. Subscribe. Like and subscribe. Okay, we're at the home stretch where we can mount this to the lathe and get it finished up. But while it's still on the bench, I complete my pattern and then I draw a couple of reference lines, and those reference lines will make it very easy for me to glue up each ring on the lathe. And I'm using a glue block made from a chunk of cherry. I first glue on the base, which is a chunk of Purple Heart. And as you can see, I like to use my cold jaws to center each piece. You can see here how those reference lines really come in handy. Okay, we'll fast forward a bit, and here's the final glue up. Every time I go at the lathe with a new project, I always try to go with a new sharpened carbide cutter as well. When you buy these cutters, they're advertised as being disposable. However, people don't realize you can still sharpen these very easily. I made this carbide cutting station for all my carbide cutters. I use a 600 grit diamond stone. This lapping fluid that you see me applying will help dissipate all that carbide dust. And just a little pressure is needed. Rub it in circular motions, and as you can see, that lapping fluid's starting to get dark. That's all the little pieces of carbide dust that's actually being sharpened from the carbide cutter. Once done, this carbide cutter is going to be brand new, sharp as a razor. And incidentally, I've been using this same carbide cutter for about 4 years now. So there goes the disposable theory. After I've attached the cutter back to my tool, I like to take a Sharpie and draw one line on the cutter. This will act as a reference line for me to use once I rotate the cutter as it gets dull. Okay, so I'm about to turn the piece. I like to provide some pressure to the rim to prevent vibration, and this can simply be done by pressing a disc from my tailstock, as you can see here. I'm turning the outside first, then I'll remove the disc and then turn the inside. Now, because I've got a lot of glue dried on the surface of this brim, I'm not going to use my carbide in fear of major tear out. So I'm going to start with a few nibble cuts here with my 1/2-inch bowl gouge. Now that I've gotten those glue peaks all carved out, I'll switch over to my carbide. Because we're cutting side grain, these carbide cutters leave a very smooth surface. Once I've finished roughing out an area of all its high points, I'll then switch over to my negative rake scraper. As I've said before, these exotic woods are very dry and they're very brittle. If I was to get a catch using traditional tools at this point, the bowl would actually explode off the lathe. Don't ask me how I know. This negative rake scraper will prevent that from happening. It will also prevent any tear out. It's important to stop your piece once in a while to inspect your progress. It's also important to move and adjust your tool rest whenever appropriate. Many accidents at the lathe are usually the result of a poorly placed tool rest. I'm shaping this foot so it's going to have a nice graceful curve to match the rim. Okay, now that the outside is complete, I'll start on the inside. But first I take my thickness calipers here to see how much meat I've got left on the bone. And it looks like I've got an average of about 1/4 of an inch. So my goal is to turn this piece down to 1/8 of an inch. So I've got plenty of room to work with. I also attached my homemade steady rest. The light pressure from those wheels will keep the piece from vibrating, and I'll get a smooth cut. I've switched over to my Jimmy Clues tool. This is the Mate 1. It's a cupped carbide cutter, and it cuts very smoothly, and it leaves no tear out. And because this cutter is cupped with no flat surface, it's actually slicing through the wood grain, leaving those fine shavings. Whereas a flat carbide cutter is more of a scraper, and it will tend to leave a little more dust. Now that the walls are fairly close to that 1/8 of an inch goal of mine, I switch over to my negative rake scraper. And as you can see, I've been starting from the brim and I work my way down to the bottom of the bowl. I'll switch back to the cupped carbide for the high spots, then back to the negative rake for the low spots, and I work my way all the way to the bottom. I utilize my calipers to maintain a uniform thickness. Turn vessels that usually split and crack after a few years are usually the result of improper thickness. A uniform thickness will allow the piece to expand and contract uniformly with the weather. For example, in warmer weather, a thicker wall will expand slower than a thinner wall. So if you have an inconsistent thickness in a wall, the wood's going to want to expand at different times, resulting in splits, where when the wall is uniform, it will all expand at the same time and then contract at the same time with the weather. And now I'm switching back over to my Jimmy Clues hollowing tool. Again, it's a cupped carbide cutter. This one, however, is what they call the Mate #2, slightly bigger. What's great about this is I can take aggressive cuts and I will absolutely not get any catches at all. And it leaves a nice smooth finish and no tear out. And look how incredibly smooth that is. With all that end grain, you would think there would be tear out all over the place, but not with this tool. Now all that's left is a couple of passes with my negative rake scraper, and I'll get a super smooth finish. And that's it. It's all finished. I'm not going to show my sanding and my finishing technique in this video. I've done that several times in the past, so you can please refer to one of my other videos if you want to see that. So here you see the bowl. It's all done. It's all shaped. And here she is, all sanded and complete. The color looks so much more vibrant once it's finished. I sanded up to 600 grit, then I buffed the piece with Triple E, 1 coat of my homemade sanding sealer, and 3 coats of my homemade spray lacquer. And if you're curious, here's a picture of one of the Angelum bowls that I made. And if you'd like to see some more of my finishing technique, I'll leave a link to one of my other videos below. Well, that concludes another one. Thanks for joining me today. If you found something interesting, or if you learned something, please leave me a like and subscribe to my channel. Until the next one, cheers.